This is the Content Marketing Podcast, episode number 162. Tim Matthews joins us to talk about creating powerful personas. Hello and welcome to the Content Marketing Podcast. This is the show where we help you attract and retain business through the power of quality content. I'm your host, Rachel Parker of Resonance Content Marketing, and today is February 18th, 2016. Hello, or as we say in Texas, howdy, and thank you for joining us for today's episode of the Content Marketing Podcast. Just a reminder, we are live on iTunes and on Stitcher, so if you're listening to this episode on the blog, you can click on over and subscribe. And if you use a different app for your podcast listening pleasure, we also have an RSS feed, and I will provide that link in the blog post. I also invite you to download your free copy of our brand new ebook. It's called Ninja Secrets of B2B Blogging, and you can get your very own copy at b2bbloggingebook.com. And that's the numeral 2 in B2B. Okay, a little bit of internal news here. I just glanced at our numbers, folks, and we are just over 99,000 downloads for the Content Marketing Podcast. Wow, that just amazes me. And man, I would love for us to hit that 100,000 mark. So I'm going to ask you a favor. Actually, I'm going to repeat the favor that I asked you to do last week. Now, if you're driving, please wait until you are safely parked to do this. But I would love for you to share this podcast. So whether you're listening on iTunes or Stitcher or on another app, if you look at your screen, somewhere on that screen will be a share button. And if you enjoy this podcast and the content that we share, I'm going to ask you to tap that little share button and share this podcast on at least one social network. Share it on Twitter, share it on Facebook, share it on LinkedIn, whatever your hangout of choice is. I would love for you to, would you do that for me right now, please? I would so appreciate it. Now, again, if you're driving, please wait until you're safely parked. Don't want to cause any incidents. But if you would take a moment to share this episode, you would absolutely make my day. Okay, on to business. Last week, we welcomed our friend Jay Baer back to the podcast to chat about his latest book, Hug Your Haters. And if you happen to miss that, I recommend that you check it out. Jay is always so entertaining and has such incredible insights to share. We had a great conversation. So if you happen to miss that episode, feel free to check it out on iTunes or Stitcher or via the RSS feed. Today we have another terrific interview for you. Tim Matthews is going to be stopping by to share some advice on how we can create powerful blog personas. But first, it's time to check in with our news feed for this week's rundown of news you can use. Got some news out of Instagram to kick off this week's news feed. Now, if you are active on Instagram, especially if you are on the network both for your company and for yourself, today's news will elicit a great big old yee-haw because Instagram now allows you to switch between accounts without logging out and logging back in. And that for me is just woohoo! Because before it was a pain, right? You had to log out of Instagram, you had to log back in, had to remember your login, blah, blah, blah. But now you can actually manage up to 5 accounts and switch between them within the app. So if you have your personal Instagram and your marketing team Instagram and maybe an organization that you support, you do their Instagram for them, you can actually manage all those from within the app. So to access this feature, go to your profile settings and scroll down to Add Account. And all you're going to do is type in your login and password for the account you want to add, and you are ready to roll. Great news out of Instagram. Okay, new Twitter feature also. Now, Twitter has been kind of under fire lately. I don't know if you heard, they recently had some executives leave, and more recently they talked about, or the news started getting out that they're considering some changes to their to the way they display tweets. Sometimes they're tweets. But anyway, this week they announced a new feature. It is an option, so it's not part of the ads is an option that will let you see the tweets you're most likely to care about, and they will appear at the top of your timeline. This feature is available on iOS and Android devices. And if you want to check it out, go to the timeline section of your settings and choose Show Me the Best Tweets First. Now, I don't know about you, but as a user, not necessarily as a marketer, but as a user, I am always leery of any app deciding for me what I think will be important. That's just call me old-fashioned. This is a little too big brother for me. But I have to wonder if this is a reaction to the leaked story or to the rumor that Twitter is considering a switch from time-based reporting to more of an algorithm approach. And this might be their way of saying, well, we'll give you the option of using this algorithm and seeing how it goes. I don't know how that's going to play out, but of course, stay tuned to this podcast and we will keep you posted. Okay, our content hit of the week is a post called 5 Simple Strategies to Improve Your Blog's Search Rankings. This is a post by Daniel Fagella over on Search Engine Land. And, I always keep up with the search engine, with the SEO folks in my content marketing pursuit because we need to know about it. We need to know what's going on in SEO. We need to know how we can keep the Google beast fed and happy so that more people can find us through search. So whenever I find, but here's my dilemma. Whenever I find SEO advice for bloggers, it seems it's one of two extremes. It's either total fluff, the same stuff we've been hearing, blog about good topics and, write good headlines, blah, blah, blah. Or it's so deeply technical on that SEO slide that it flies completely over my head. So one thing I like about this post is that Daniel offers us a happy medium. It's advice that is current, that's innovative, that we haven't heard a million times, but it's also not so deep on the technical side of SEO that it's incomprehensible for those of us artsy folks, and we know who we are, don't we? So anyway, very good read, highly recommended, and I will provide the link in the blog post for this episode for your reading pleasure. Okay, that's it for this week's update. If you stumble across something you think might be of interest to your fellow content marketers, please shoot it on over to us so that we can share. Now it's time for this week's Spotlight segment. Tim Matthews stops by to give us some advice on creating powerful blog personas. We've talked a lot about personas on this podcast, about the importance of really knowing that person that you are creating your content for, and creating a persona, actually creating a fictitious person to represent the kind of ideal person you want engaging with your content. And that's why I was so excited to hear from Chris Matthews. He knows a lot about creating personas. He's created for multiple clients, and he was kind enough to join us today to share his expertise. So let me tell you a little about him. Tim Matthews was born in New York City and grew up in a nearby leafy suburb before taking the long route to Silicon Valley through Tokyo, believe it or not. He has worked in high tech for 20 years and managed marketing teams at 6 companies. When not writing or poring over marketing text, he golfs, crosswords, and tries to keep up with his wife on a stand-up paddleboard. He has long wondered which is harder, crossing the chasm or a 200-yard carry over a water hazard. Tim is also the author of The Professional Marketer, which we will tell you more about here in a bit. Without further ado, here is my interview with Tim Matthews on creating powerful personas. Hey, Tim, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, I just gave our listeners an official read-through of your bio, but give us a little bit more personal introduction to who you are and what you do.
Sure. I am a head of marketing at a cloud security and performance company here in Silicon Valley. I've been doing marketing for over 15 years. Mm-hmm. And on the side, I do quite a bit of writing and speaking about marketing, which is one of my passions.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. So I was really happy to hear from you, Chris, because you talk a lot about personas for your content, and that's something that I stress so much to my audience. We've got to know our audiences. It's that old Monopoly, do not pass go, do not collect $200 until you know exactly who you're talking to.
Yes, I'm a big believer. I've been using personas for the last couple jobs I've had in marketing. It's a great tool.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. So before we get too deep into our conversation, let's just clarify for those who might not be familiar with the concept. What is a persona?
A persona, or sometimes it's called an archetype, is a description of your target customer with a bit of information about their likes, dislikes, needs, what kind of information they need from you, what their fears are, really getting to know the person who is going to be buying your product or service.
Yep, absolutely. And from a content perspective, why are personas important to us as content marketers?
Well, I'll tell you a little story. So it was several years ago when I first began to use personas that I asked somebody who their customer is, and they said banking and financial services. And I said, that's number one, that's not a person. That's not even very specific when you talk about a bank, because there are lots of different kinds of banks. But who inside that bank are you speaking to? Is it an IT person? Is it the CEO? Is it is it the receptionist? And how can you possibly reach that person and create a message that's compelling if you don't know who they are and what it is that drives them and what they're afraid of and what they want to know from you? So there was that conversation, or maybe it was the nth time I had that same conversation, that I realized, gosh, we've got to do better than this. We've got to really understand who our buyers are, which has been probably told to marketers from the beginning of marketing, but people still ignore it because it's like a lot of things. It's hard. It takes work.
Yeah, I get that. I get that a lot too, Tim. As you might imagine, I'll ask a company, who is your target audience, and they'll say, well, and they're very proud of knowing that it's mid-sized engineering companies in the oil and gas industry. Okay. Great. When's the last time you shook hands with a mid-sized engineering company in the oil and gas industry?
Exactly right.
Exactly
right.
So, Tim, when a lot of marketers hear the word personas and a lot of the things that you're talking about, they think that it's going to involve this huge overblown project where they have to bring in this expensive marketing research firm, and it's going to go on for months, and it's going to cost them thousands of dollars. What do you say when people come back with that objection?
Well, if you want to spend a lot of money, you certainly can do that. However, I would even say that even after you pay someone a lot of money, the results you get won't be as good as if you do the interviews yourself. In fact, I don't even like to rely on people in my building, my salespeople, to tell me who the buyers are. I want to speak directly to the buyer. And it's really not a lot of work. I'll be honest. My little tip is the hardest part of buyer personas is scheduling the interviews. So if you have an admin or someone like that can help you schedule the half-an-hour phone conversations, that's the hardest part. The rest is just having a conversation with your customers and your desired customers. And it's kind of fun because you're not selling them. It's not a pressure situation. You're not to be salesy. You're just asking them about, what do you do? It's like meeting someone at a cocktail party. What do you do for a living? Interesting. What's your biggest challenge? What do you find difficult to accomplish? And you get down to what we call customer pain points, customer pain. But it's a lot of fun, and you find out really interesting stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing about talking to current customers is like, these are people who have signed on the dotted line. It's like they're buying what you're selling. So why would you not talk to them?
Exactly. And the other thing about persona research is it's a great way to get your marketing team exposed to customers. Quite often, especially in larger companies, marketing teams don't get the opportunity to speak to an actual customer because the sales guys don't want them anywhere near their customers because they might mess up the deal or say something wrong or who knows what. So this is a great exercise to just reach out and understand who these people really are. And it's actually more common for companies not to do persona research than it is for them to do it. So if you do it, you're going to be, I think, in a competitively advantageous situation against your competition.
Yep. So in this post that you sent me, Tim, a great post that you wrote for Marketing Profs, you talk about buyer persona and blog persona. So how do you get from one to the other?
Sure. So for me, it comes down to, what do your buyers want to read? Because quite often we spend all day in marketing cranking in all kinds of content that is irrelevant or uninteresting or flat boring. And so the idea is, once you understand who your buyers are, let's just say, for example, that you're selling to paralegals. What do paralegals do all day, and what would make their jobs easier? And if you understand that, then you can create a whole list of things to write about that paralegals are going to want to read, and you can publish it on your blog. So that's the connection, is figuring out who these people are and a bit about their needs and their aspirations is a really good one too, we'll talk about. And then figuring out how to work that into your content calendar or your blog calendar.
Yep, absolutely. So the first thing in your 5-step process is to identify target buyers, which is kind of just exactly what you've been talking about, creating a persona of what does that person look like.
Right.
Okay. And would that be a combination of current customers and prospective buyers? How do we come up with that?
That's a great question. So obviously talk to your head of sales, your CEO, whomever, find out who they're selling to, but don't ignore potential customers. I think every executive I've ever spoken to wants to grow his or her business. And maybe there's someone you're missing, and maybe you're missing them because you're not approaching them in the right way and you don't have the right content. So you don't ignore potential customers as well as existing customers, which, by the way, is why you got to be careful talking to salespeople, because sometimes salespeople only sell to who they know, not who your ultimate customer could be. So don't fall into that trap.
And you raise an interesting point, not to overlook the new types of buyers you want to attract. If you want to get into a new market or somebody who is not in your current customer list, it's important to include those people as well.
Absolutely. And you may find out through your research that, in fact, they're not a good fit. Once you speak to them, you may realize that the product you have or the service you offer isn't right, and that it was just an idea that came from the CEO or a board member. And now you can come back with credible research, first-person research, that will actually support that point.
Yep. So from there, we move on to conducting the persona interviews. And you recommend, instead of just kind of getting on the phone and saying, okay, tell me, give me your feedback, to actually use a tool like a checklist to go through some of those questions.
Yeah, sometimes when you're interviewing somebody, they hang up the phone, you think, I forgot to ask them the most important question. Or, because you may be talking about football or the weather, or, you may get sidetracked onto when are you going to be releasing the new version of your product or whatever, which is more about, stuff they want to know from your company. And you forget to ask them things that are really important. And sometimes they can be hard questions, or at least maybe a little uncomfortable, like, what's your biggest challenge? And I train people to ask that question and shut up, and make sure you probe a bit. Oh, why is that? What's the impact on your business? What's the impact on you? So when you have a checklist, you can make sure that you are covering all that you need to know. And sometimes it's useful to have two people on the call, one person who's taking notes and making sure you're getting through everyone, and someone who can just be more natural on the phone with the customer.
Right. And that's an interesting point. You talk about asking the questions and then being quiet. There is incredible power in silence when you're having these conversations.
Yeah, silence and asking open-ended questions. Don't ask yes/no questions or questions that can be quantified with a number. Those aren't bad. But just asking those open-ended questions is where you're going to hear, I think, the interesting stuff, when people really start opening up to you.
Yeah. Tim, have you ever come across a situation where your team approached someone for an interview and they were very leery because they thought it was going to be a thinly veiled sales pitch?
Absolutely. So one of the first things I say to somebody is, I'm not going to try and sell you anything today. Is that okay with you? Which is not an open-ended question, but it generally puts them at ease and lets them know that I'm really not there to sell them anything. And yes, that's sometimes why it's hard to schedule these interviews, because people presume it's a veiled sales call. So it can take some work to make sure people are comfortable. And it might take a personal outreach from the CMO or head of marketing saying, look, I'm really not going to sell you anything, and explain why you're asking. We're trying to build content that is more useful to you. Could you help us by giving us 30 minutes of your time and telling us, what you do all day? Yeah, absolutely. And you bring up a really good example, Tim, when you talk about an insight that came about while you were at Symantec, and you were talking about heads of information security. So how did you really dig deep and get down to their biggest challenges? So this came out during one particular interview that one of my people was conducting. And we'd been working under the assumption that heads of security cared about knowing about the latest security incidents. It turned out that their biggest concern or need was to be able to communicate effectively in the boardroom. that people weren't taking them seriously. They were seen as alarmists who couldn't have a business conversation about risk. And that came up during one call, and a very astute woman that worked for me noticed it. And then we began to ask about that in subsequent calls. And this is a great example of, A, if you don't talk to your customers, you'll never find stuff like that out. And B, just having a long conversation brings out these issues that weren't on your radar before. So it can be very, very powerful. And that changed our whole content strategy. We stopped writing about the latest and greatest, I shouldn't use the word greatest, the latest security incidents. And we started writing about how to present risk in the boardroom, and even finding authors from third parties that were more business-oriented than security-oriented. And that really helped our content.
Yeah, great example. So from those persona interviews, then you talk about surveying for content ideas. So the first part, you get the information of how they do their job, what they do all day, what their challenges are. And then it looks like you get a little bit more detailed and talk about what kind of content they want and where they get it from.
Yes, and those are two important points. One is you have to ask them, what would they like to hear from you? And this is a point where you may need to be suggestive. You may need to say, would you like to see information about security incidents or about boardroom risk discussions? Or would you like to read about changes in the regulatory environment or how to be a more effective leader? And let them self-select. So you have to maybe even prompt them, because sometimes people don't really know what they like to read, or they can't off the top of their head think of it. So that's how you find out, what they want. And you can also do surveys. You can use SurveyMonkey and send it out to your customer base. And I would suggest a combination of specific questions with, would you like to see this, this, or this? And open-ended, what are you not getting from us that you'd like to see? What are you getting from our competition that you think we should be writing? There's any number of ways you can ask this. The second part of this is making sure you've got the right style and packaging. So if your target buyers read the Wall Street Journal, write like the Wall Street Journal. Maybe even hire some former Wall Street Journal reporters or freelancers. If you're selling to the BuzzFeed crowd and people want listicles, then write listicles. That's how they consume information. So the great thing about this is not only will it be perfect for your customers, but you can give it to your writers as an example. You can say, write me an article that looks like this, or a listicle that looks like this. And it's useful as a model, especially if you're using third-party freelancers to write your stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So from there, Tim, you talk about a concept that you developed called a content target. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so one day I was speaking to a product marketing manager, and he was proposing that we write content about our product. I forget if it was a data sheet or a white paper or something like that. I work in the B2B world, so we tend to write these very dense sheets with a lot of product specifications. And I was trying to explain to him that as people, we don't think about product speeds and feeds until we're ready to buy. We're very far along in the buying cycle. So for me, the content target, if you can visualize an archery target where the product content is in the middle, it is the bullseye, but that's a really small area that's hard to hit. So how could we expand our target area to include things like job development skills, how to advance my career, right? And the very outer ring is general interest stories, stories about the Super Bowl. I don't advise people spend a lot of time there, but spend time thinking about people's careers and jobs and how you can hit that, maybe not the bullseye ring, but one or two rings out to talk about job skills, career advancement skills. These are really appealing to your customers, and they'll draw people in further up the funnel, expanding your content target area. And then over time, you can nurture them toward that bullseye, which is your product. And that's in a nutshell the content target.
Yeah, it also opens up your fishing grounds, if you will, as well. Because if you're talking about product all the time, you're going to run out of posts in about 2 weeks.
Absolutely. And it's also much easier to hire writers. Again, if you're writing about career development skills, it's probably much easier to find somebody in the world who can write about that than something about your specific product or service, which requires years of experience inside your company.
Yeah, and then also you're building up more trust among your target audience because they know you're just not just talking about your specific product or service all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about you, but for example, I'm a golfer. I don't spend a lot of time reading specs of golf clubs.
Right.
I do spend time reading about great golf courses, tips on how to be a better golfer. So if you take that analogy and apply it to your whatever your product happens to be, just think about that in your own world. You as a customer, what do you spend time reading that's related to your hobby or your passion?
And I don't know about you, Tim, but when I start to have those conversations with clients, they tend to get a little uneasy because they think, well, we're not talking about our product or service. We're not marketing. We're just talking about stuff, and that's not going to help our process. Do you ever run into conversations like that?
All the time. And I think that's where the target concept comes in handy because you can show the connections. So, somebody who is eventually, again, I work in the software world, so I use a software example. Somebody who's going to buy an accounting software package, their day job has to do with getting the books closed, right? Or financial planning if they're a financial planner. And so you can show a natural progression from useful information that helps them get their job done or advance their careers and your product. And of course, you can write tutorial content, which I'm a big fan of. Even in the golf example, you can have your golf club featured in the tutorial on how to be a better chipper around the green or whatever it happens to be. So customers don't mind if you use your product as an example if it's not coming across as salesy. And again, that's a nice way to connect the buyer needs with useful data that starts to incorporate your products to then very specific data. And like you said, they're going to trust you because you provide useful information and do it in a way that's not so in their face.
Yeah, it's like walking up to someone at a cocktail party. You don't immediately start talking about your product and services. You start a conversation first, right?
Right, exactly right.
Yeah. So armed with all this information that we've just gotten, the next step is to create a buyer-focused blog calendar. And sometimes this is when people get nervous as well because they think it's going to be some big elaborate tool. I'm probably going to have to buy software for it. I'm going to have to maintain and hire someone to manage it for me. But tell us about how complicated it is not to create a blog calendar.
By my estimation, it involves adding 2 or 3 columns to your existing table or spreadsheet that you use to track your assets. So all you're going to do is, if you've got a calendar of topics for your blog, you probably have a date and a writer already. Just add the buyer, the type of content. So, for example, is it a job skill, how to, industry trends? What is it? And then I like to add what I call the outcome. What do you want someone to do after they've read this content? Ideally, subscribe to your blog, download a full report, whatever the case might be. It's as simple as that. And I think it just helps to focus the team, especially if you've got a team that involves, freelancers or third parties. They get it. All right, in my example in the blog, I'm writing for a paralegal or an attorney. And is this industry trends or how to? And my goal for your post is to drive somebody toward a blog subscription. And when you crystallize it like that, then, for example, when they write the close to the blog, they could write a kicker that says, want to learn more about international changes in immigration laws? Subscribe to our blog. We write about it every month. So then the writer is aware of what you're trying to do, and he writes or she writes the call to action in the kicker of your blog. It's that simple. So it's not a big deal. And I would recommend don't buy fancy software to do this. Use Excel or Google Docs or whatever you use. Whiteboard, whatever works.
Yep, exactly. Well, Tim, how can we, one of the other things that you talk about is bringing in guest bloggers to vary things up a little bit. So how can we identify the best guest bloggers, bring them in, kind of induct them to how we create content and let them enhance our current blogging process?
Sure. So there are no shortage of people who want to write guest posts for notoriety or to build their portfolio, what have you. When you have this buyer-focused blog calendar, you can yourself identify what you need. So if I'm going to write about legal reform and I work at a software company, chances are I've got no experts in-house. So I know I've got to go find somebody. And then it's not too hard to Google to find experts. There are tools you can use. I'm a big fan of a product called BuzzSumo which lets you identify influencers who are writing or, retweeting or whatever about certain topics. So you can find these people, and it's actually not hard to get someone to guest blog for free. The trick is to make sure you're specifically looking for the right person. You know what you need. So it's not, but again, this whole process crystallizes who you're looking for.
Yep, exactly. So after we've done all this, Tim, and created these personas and created our calendar, and we're out there creating that persona focused content, how do we know if we're being successful?
Yeah, this is where the outcomes are important. So look at your blog subscription. That's probably the number one indicator. Is it going up? Look at the engagement time on your blog posts and your bounce rate. Are people looking at multiple entries, for example? So again, that's why I don't just like to have a calendar without an outcome. I like to have the outcomes that we can track. And so you can track this in any number of ways. But if you're not moving the needle, something is wrong. Either you got the wrong buyer, the content's not right, or maybe your solution's not relevant. But it'll be a good objective conversation you can have, as opposed to someone who just, likes their blogs. Think they look nice, but don't have any metrics. And of course, you can also look at things like engagement in the comment section, that kind of thing. So I would look at a number of statistics to see if you're being successful.
Yep.
And of course, you can always go back to the people you interviewed and say, what do you think? Do we have it right? And that's the other nice thing about doing persona research is, again, marketers don't always have the relationship with the customer. Once you interview somebody, you can always send them, an email or two. Don't bombard them, but generally they're happy to say, yeah, this is interesting, or no, it's not. And you can also self-correct that way.
Yep, absolutely. Tim, you brought up B2B a few minutes ago, and I did want to ask, the challenge, one of the many challenges with B2B marketing is that decision-making tends to happen at different levels. So how can we appeal to personas at each level of that decision-making process and deliver the appropriate content to take them to the next step towards becoming a customer?
Right. So my flip answer is write more content, because you're going to have more people reading it. But you've put your finger on a very important topic, which in B2B we call the buying center, which is just a fancy phrase for the group of people who make decisions. Typically, in our case in software, it's some technical evaluator, then that person's manager, maybe somebody in finance or procurement. And so you may have to have different content for the different people. A thing I'm a big fan of is what I call pass up content. So it's content that the evaluator can pass up to his or her boss to help persuade them. So that's really the next step. Once you identify your buying center, think about the type of content that you need to write, and make sure you have the appropriate amount of content for each function.
Yep, absolutely. Another thing about B2B content specifically, Tim, I talk to a lot of B2B marketers, and they say, well, we can never have a blog. Our product's not sexy. but so how does having a persona help them to see that their product is as sexy as it needs to be?
Great question. Quite often what you find is the people in marketing are nothing like the buyers. And so I'll use a random example. So people that repair generators, right, for disaster recovery. I know nothing about generators, but those people buy a lot of expensive equipment, and they engage companies that offer expensive service contracts. So those people, it may not be sexy, but it needs to be useful. So what do those people care about? Do they care about, I don't know, ways to have less downtime? Probably. Maintenance tips for machines, trends in disaster recovery. Who knows? I mean, you can pick any mundane topic, and there are hours of content. I once had the pleasure, and I don't mean this in a disrespectful way, but I gave a presentation at an accounting conference, and I'm not an accountant. They were there for days talking about accounting, a topic for which I have very little interest. But clearly there's content that they cared about that they were discussing for several days. So it may not be your cup of tea, but that's the point. Don't project yourself on your buyer. Find out what they want and write for them. And, go Google any random topic. My favorite one is skills for lathe operators, right? Those guys need a lot of training. Who's providing the content? There's any number of things you could write about that's not sexy, but it's impactful.
Yeah, one of my favorite B2B examples is Caterpillar. I mean, they create just reams of beautiful content, and they make tractors and backhoes.
Yeah. Those tractors are expensive.
They are.
That's a big company. I mean, there's a huge market out there, obviously. I think sometimes we forget that things that we don't care about are really important to other people.
Yep, absolutely. Well, Tim, this has been a great conversation about personas, and I don't want you to let you get away without talking about your book. You have a book out called The Professional Marketer. So tell us a little bit about that.
The Professional Marketer is a handbook for marketers. What I found over the last 10 years or so in managing large teams is there are people on marketing teams who were never formally trained, or maybe they were only trained in one very specific area, and there's so much to know in marketing. Yeah. And I actually looked around for a book that would cover the A to Z, the soup to nuts of marketing, everything from positioning and market planning through how to write a press release, through how to build a budget. And I couldn't find a single book I could hand to somebody. There are a lot of great marketing books that are single topic. There are, the seminal works like Ogilvy on Advertising, which I highly recommend, but nothing I could hand someone as a handbook.
Yeah.
And so as I joked to my wife, not knowing what I was getting into, I couldn't buy the book, so I decided to write it.
Okay. Right. Great. And the subtitle is everything you need to know but were never taught. Is that?
Yeah, I don't know about you, but I received very little formal marketing training. A lot of it is on the job or occasional courses, and so I felt the need to put something together that was really a compendium of all the critical skills. And the title, by the way, comes from my wife, who formerly was a professional chef. Ooh. And the way that chefs are trained is they're trained in the fundamentals of cooking. The mother sauces, as they're called, the techniques for grilling. They don't follow recipes. And so I use that analogy for the professional marketer. I'm not going to tell you how to market your product, but I'm going to teach you the fundamental techniques of marketing, and you can apply them as you need to in your market. Because I can't tell you how to market tractors or lathes or what have you. That's not my area of expertise.
So it's kind of the joy of cooking, but for the marketing side.
Yeah, it's actually it's not the joy of cooking. It's actually the cookbook, or the manual, I should say, they use at the Culinary Institute of America, where my wife went, is called The Professional Chef. Okay. And the Professional Chef is that skills training guide as opposed to a recipe guide. And we always have trouble at dinner parties because people ask my wife for the recipe, and of course there isn't one. So she has to go back and write it down for them by hand.
Right.
But that was the concept. I was for a long time thinking, what am I going to call this book? And I was sitting in my kitchen and it's sitting right there on the shelf, and I thought, maybe I'll just borrow that idea and apply it to marketing.
That's great, Tim. And I know it's so especially needed, especially today when marketing, I mean, we're seeing people come in from journalism, people coming in from creative writing, and people who have the skills they need to be successful marketers. They just don't have that training like you talked about.
That's right. And, for example, in B2B, salespeople go through extensive salesmanship training. And I thought we needed something similar for marketers. And I welcome everybody into the marketing tent. And I think it's a great place to be these days. There's so many cool new technologies and possibilities for selling and reaching buyers. But people still need to know the fundamentals.
Yep, exactly. So, Tim, if someone would like to pick up a copy of The Professional Marketer, or 2 or 3 or 5, where would they go to find it?
Yes, I do have kids who will be entering college soon.
Okay.
So you can go to 2 places. You can go to Amazon and just search for The Professional Marketer. Or if you want to read some of my other writing, you can go to Matthews on Marketing, which is my blog, and there's also a link to the book there. Okay,
great. And if we go to Matthews on Marketing, we'll find your Twitter connection and LinkedIn and all that other good stuff?
Absolutely. I'm just at Tim Matthews SV, but all of my presentations and writings and social coordinates are all there.
Okay, wonderful. Well, Tim, thank you so much for joining us today to talk a little bit about blog personas and enlightening our audience.
It's been a lot of fun. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Tim, and enjoy your day.
Take care.
All right. Many thanks again to Tim Matthews for joining us to chat about creating powerful blog personas. To learn more about Tim and to grab a copy of his book, you can go to MatthewsOnMarketing.com. And Matthews is Matthews, MatthewsOnMarketing.com, where you'll also find links to connect with him on Twitter, LinkedIn, and SlideShare. Of course, if you have any questions or want to add to the conversation, I would love to hear from you. And the best way to reach me is through our website, resonancecontent.com. Now it's time for our content marketing tip of the week. Sometimes when I talk to marketers about their audiences and about creating their personas, they say, well, Rachel, it's kind of sticky because we serve some very different types of audiences. For example, your B2B company may serve both nonprofit and for-profit organizations who can have very different needs. They have some of the same needs, but they have some needs that are very, very different. For example, nonprofits rely on grants and donations for their funding, and they need to, if your B2B business is in a position to help them, then that's the kind of stuff we need to be sharing. So there are different ways to deal with that situation of having very different audiences. If you have a smaller audience and a smaller blog, we can simply attach tags that specify the audience and then make sure in our titles that we make clear who we are speaking to. That, for example, the nonprofit audience, want to make sure we're specifying them in the headline. Or you can create separate blogs, actually separate entities for each of your audiences. For example, if you go to HubSpot's main blog page, you will see 3 options. They have a marketing blog, a sales blog, and an agency blog, each of which represents a key audience for them. So however you choose to organize your audience-specific content, remember, the key is making it easy for your audience to find the content that speaks to them. You may want to try different approaches and do a beta test, try it both ways. And you may also want to ask some trusted customers how they would prefer to find the content that speaks to them. Because remember, if it doesn't work for if it doesn't work for your audience, then it won't work for you. So make sure that you're making it easy for that audience to find content that speaks to their specific needs. Okay, campers, that is it for me today. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Content Marketing Podcast. And I want to say thank you again to our very special guest, Tim Matthews. If you like what you've heard today, please feel free to subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher or via our RSS feed. And if you really like what you've heard, please leave us a quick review on iTunes. I would so appreciate it. And don't forget to share this podcast when you have a moment. That would be fantastic. Also, don't forget to grab your free copy of our new ebook, Ninja Secrets of B2B Blogging, at b2bbloggingebook.com. And that's the numeral 2 in B2B. As always, I like to leave you with a quote, and today's comes from Guy Kawasaki. He once said, quote, "Want to change the world? Upset the status quo? This takes more than run-of-the-mill relationships. You need to make people dream the same dream that you do." Unquote. Again, this is Rachel Parker with Resonance Content Marketing. Thank you again for listening, and we will see you again next week. Take care.